In the spring of 1979, Van Halen were the hottest band in America. Their debut album had gone platinum. They had spent 10.5 months on the road, playing every night, building an audience that had gone from a few hundred people in a club in Pasadena to tens of thousands in arenas across the country. They had opened for Black Sabbath and destroyed them. They had opened for Montrose and destroyed them. They had played shows in cities that had never heard of them and left those cities with fans who would follow them for the rest of their lives. The debut album was selling. The tour was a triumph. Everything, from the outside, looked exactly like the beginning of a great career. And then Van Halen came home, and Warner Brothers Records called them in for a meeting. And in that meeting, the people who had signed them, who had put their record out, who had watched the album go platinum and the venues sell out, and the audiences lose their minds night after night across America, told Van Halen something that the band had not been expecting. They owed the label $2 million. They had sold a platinum album. They had toured for 10.5 months. They had worked as hard as 4 human beings in a rock band could possibly work, and they were $2 million in debt to the company that had released their music. This is the story of how that happened, why nobody outside the band knew it for years, how it nearly ended Van Halen before the second album was recorded, and how the decision that was made in the immediate aftermath of that meeting, a decision made under extreme financial pressure, in a rush, with almost no budget and no time, produced one of the most important albums in the history of hard rock. This is the secret that almost ended their career. To understand how Van Halen ended up $2 million in debt after a platinum debut album, you have to understand the economics of how the music industry worked in 1977. And how the contracts that record labels offered to unknown bands were structured to benefit the label almost entirely at the expense of the artist. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, the standard. The record industry had refined a system over decades that was designed to minimize risk for the label while maximizing the financial exposure of the artist. And the system was almost impossible to navigate without either significant legal expertise or prior experience of being exploited by it. Van Halen had neither. When Warner Brothers signed Van Halen in 1977, the deal was structured as what the industry called a recording contract with tour support. This meant that Warner Brothers would pay for the recording of the album, for the manufacturing and distribution of the physical product, for the promotional campaign, and for a portion of the touring costs that would be required to support the release. All of these expenses were advances, loans against future royalties. Every dollar that Warner Brothers spent on Van Halen was money that Van Halen would eventually have to pay back out of their earnings before they saw a cent of profit themselves. The royalty rate was the critical number. Van Halen's contract paid them 70 cents per album sold. 70 cents. At a moment when established artists at major labels were earning between $2.50 and $3 per unit, Van Halen was receiving less than a quarter of what the industry standard was for successful acts. This was not an oversight. It was the standard offer for an unknown band with no leverage, no track record, and no understanding of what their music would be worth once it reached the public. They needed a deal. Warner Brothers offered them a deal. They signed. What none of them fully understood in 1977, what the small print of the contract contained that was not discussed in any detail during the negotiation, was the full scope of what would be charged against their account before they began earning. The recording costs were charged back. The promotional costs were charged back. The tour support, the money Warner Brothers contributed to help Van Halen afford to put on a professional touring production, was charged back. And on top of all of that, the touring production itself had costs that came directly out of the band's share. The trucks, the crew, the equipment, the venues, the logistics of moving 4 musicians and their gear across the country for 10.5 months, all of it generated expenses that accumulated against the band's account at the label. Before getting to the numbers, it is worth pausing on what that touring year actually looked like. Van Halen in 1978 was not a band with the luxury of taking time off between shows. They were the opening act for bands like Black Sabbath and Journey and Montrose, which meant they were playing every night in front of audiences that had not come to see them, audiences that sometimes actively resisted them, audiences that had paid their money for the headliner and had no particular reason to invest emotionally in the band on before them. Every one of those shows was an audition. Every one of those shows was an opportunity to convert skeptics into believers, to take people who had never heard of Van Halen and send them home as fans. And by every account from the people who were there, the road crews, the other musicians, the promoters, Van Halen passed that audition every single night. They did not just hold the audience's attention as an opening act. They regularly stole shows from bands that had been in the industry for a decade. Black Sabbath's road crew, reportedly, was not happy about what Van Halen was doing to the crowd before their own set began. The dynamic was clear to everyone watching. This was a band that was better than its billing. But none of that changed the math. David Lee Roth later described the economics of the situation with a precision that suggested it had taken years to fully absorb. Van Halen was the first band to take huge productions into what he called third-level markets, cities and venues that had never seen the kind of technical show that Van Halen was bringing with them. The standard touring setup for a band of their level was 3 trucks. Van Halen was pulling up with 9 18-wheelers full of gear. The sound system alone weighed 22 tons. The lighting rig carried 444,000 watts. They had a 24-person technical crew. They traveled in 2 custom coaches with a Learjet for the band. And every night of those 10.5 months, all of that cost money. Money that was being counted by Warner Brothers and charged against Van Halen's account. When the album went platinum, which it did within the first year of release, Van Halen began earning royalties. 70 cents per album, split 4 ways. 17.5 cents per band member per album sold. Against the growing total of what they owed the label, the math was unforgiving. The more they sold, the more they toured to support those sales. The more they toured, the more they spent on the production that had become their identity. And the more they spent, the deeper into debt they went, even as the records sold, and the audiences grew, and the outside world understood Van Halen to be one of the most successful bands in the country. Alex Van Halen described the moment of discovery with a directness that communicated exactly how shocking it was. "We went platinum," he recalled. "We toured for a year. We came back. And Warner Brothers told us that we owed them $2 million. And on top of that, he added, with the tone of a man still processing something that defied rational explanation years later, we owed them another record. Eddie Van Halen's reaction was different from his brother's. Alex processed it as an injustice, a systemic unfairness that the music industry had imposed on them through a contract they had not been equipped to understand. Eddie processed it as a personal crisis. He had spent the previous decade building something. The band, the music, the sound that had come together in that garage in Pasadena and grown into the most exciting rock act in the country. And the institution that was supposed to be helping him bring that music to the world had structured the arrangement so that all of that work produced nothing for the people who had done it. Eddie began to consider leaving. Not the music. The music was never something he could consider abandoning. But Van Halen, the band, the specific arrangement that had put him in this position. He had conversations with Gene Simmons of Kiss during this period, conversations that went beyond the friendly connection they had maintained since Simmons had first seen Van Halen play and financed their earliest demo tape. Eddie wanted to know if there was a different way. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely entertaining the possibility of a different future, a different arrangement, a different band. The irony of Eddie considering joining Kiss was not lost on anyone who understood the history. It was Gene Simmons who had first recognized Van Halen's potential before any major label had touched them. It was Simmons who had paid out of his own pocket to fly Van Halen to Electric Lady Studios in New York, the studio that Jimi Hendrix had built, and record a proper demo tape when they were still unknown. Simmons had believed in them when the entire industry had said no. And now, 2 years later, with the debut album sitting at platinum and the world beginning to understand what Van Halen was, Eddie was calling Simmons to talk about leaving the band he had built. Gene Simmons talked him out of it, the same person who had believed in Van Halen before Warner Brothers had found them, who had paid for the recording sessions in New York that had documented what the band could do before the label got involved, now urged Eddie to stay with the band, to trust that the music was bigger than the contract and that the situation, as bad as it was financially, was survivable. The band, Simmons argued, was worth preserving. The four members together produced something that no reconfiguration would be able to replicate. Eddie needed to hear that from someone who had been in the music business long enough to understand both the injustice and the perspective. He listened. Van Halen stayed together, but the pressure did not lift. Because the meeting with Warner Brothers had not just delivered the news of the $2 million debt. It had delivered a second piece of news that was, in some ways, even more immediately urgent. Under the terms of the contract, Van Halen owed the label another album. They were required to deliver a follow-up record, and they were required to deliver it quickly, because the momentum of the debut needed to be sustained with new product if the commercial trajectory was going to continue. The band had no money. They had just been told they owed $2 million to the label that was now demanding a new record. And they had to go back into the studio and make that record with a budget that was smaller than the one they had been given for the debut, in a time frame that left almost no room for the kind of deliberate, careful construction that a great album requires. What they did instead was go back to Roth's basement. Before they had ever recorded anything professionally, before Gene Simmons and before Ted Templeman, and before the Starwood shows that had led to the Warner Brothers deal, Van Halen had rehearsed in David Lee Roth's basement in Pasadena. That was where the music had originally been made, where the songs had been written and worked out and performed until they were ready for a real audience. The basement was where Van Halen existed as a pure entity, stripped of industry pressure and commercial expectation and financial obligation. Just four people making music together because it was what they did and who they were. They went back there in late 1978, after the meeting with Warner Brothers, after Eddie's conversations with Simmons, after the full weight of what they were facing had been absorbed. They rehearsed. They went through the catalog of songs they had been playing for years, material that dated back to the Pasadena years, songs that had never made it onto the debut album, old favorites that their earliest fans had been hearing at shows for half a decade. And they went back into the studio in December 1978 with Ted Templeman and recorded Van Halen The Scent in 6 days. 6 days. For context, the average major label rock album in 1978 took weeks or months to produce. 6 days was not a creative decision. It was a financial and contractual reality. They had to deliver a record, and they had almost no resources to deliver it with. What they had instead was years of material, the discipline of 10.5 months on the road, and a producer who understood them well enough to capture what they did quickly and without wasting time on overproduction. The result was Van Halen II. It was released on March 23, 1979, 11 months after the debut had arrived in the world. It went gold in its first month. It went platinum in its second. It peaked at number 6 on the Billboard charts, a full 13 positions higher than the debut had reached. It contained Dance the Night Away, which became the band's first genuine hit single. And it was recorded for almost nothing under financial duress in 6 days by a band that had been told they were $2 million in debt and had responded by going into a basement and playing music together until they remembered why they had started. The story of how Van Halen were banned in 1979 is not the story of promoters refusing to book them or venues closing their doors. It is the story of a contract that banned them from prosperity, a legal document that prohibited 4 men who had worked harder than almost anyone in the music industry that year from seeing the financial results of that work. A system that took a platinum album and a 10.5-month tour and turned them into a $2 million debt. And the story of how they survived it is not the story of a legal victory or a renegotiated contract or a formal resolution of any kind. It is the story of going back to a basement in Pasadena and recording an album in 6 days, of making music under the worst possible conditions and producing something that reached more people and climbed higher on the charts than anything they had done before. There is a lesson in that somewhere, a lesson about the relationship between pressure and creativity, between constraint and production, between the external circumstances of a career and the internal reality of what a great band actually is. Van Halen in 1979 had nothing. They were in debt, under contract, on a deadline, and operating with a fraction of the resources that their commercial success had appeared to promise. And they made one of their best records. What the $2 million debt ultimately demonstrated was something the music industry had been designed to obscure: that the value Van Halen created had almost nothing to do with the infrastructure the label provided, and almost everything to do with what those 4 people could do together when they were left alone to do it. The debt was real. The injustice was real. And the music they made in spite of all of it was also real and more durable than either. By the time their third album, Women and Children First, was released in 1980, the balance of power had shifted. Van Halen's commercial success had given them leverage they had not had in 1977. The terms of their relationship with Warner Brothers improved. The debt was eventually addressed, and the band that had nearly broken apart in the spring of 1979 over a meeting in a conference room in Burbank, where accountants delivered news that made a platinum album feel like a punishment, went on to spend the next several years becoming the biggest rock band in the world. They did it by going back to the basement, by playing the music, by refusing to let the financial reality that had been imposed on them define what they were or what they could produce, by trusting that the band was bigger than the contract, which was exactly what Gene Simmons had told Eddie Van Halen when Eddie was considering walking away. He was right, and the proof is in the music. If this story changes how you hear Van Halen, if it makes Dance the Night Away sound different now that you know what it cost to record it and what was riding on it, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this is what we do here every week. We find the real story underneath the music you love, the one that makes it mean more than it already did. Subscribe now, leave a comment telling me what you think about a system that can turn a platinum album into a $2 million debt, and share this video with every Van Halen fan you know. They know every word of every song. Now they know what those songs actually cost.